Can I start by, Acting President, recalling something that I said in my inaugural speech in this place. I said, and I quote, that politics was a means to an end, and that end always has been and always must be good public policy. I went on to say that the policy outcome must always be paramount to what we do, must always be paramount to what I do. And to that end, Acting President, let me say from the outset, or not a surprise given that I put a media statement to this effect some weeks ago, that I will indeed be supporting the bill. I believe, without a doubt, that we need to have a look at a range of issues in relation to the policy that we're attempting to legislate right now. But before I do, I think it's important, in the same vein as Mr Purcell raised, issues about consultation, coordination, representation of our community. And indeed, when we had this debate back on the 15th of April in 2015, which I believe was in response to Ms Hartland's motion to refer it to the Law Commission, I read back my Hansard yesterday and I was a little bit surprised at what I had said. Not surprised in terms of the content, but I have to say I'd not gone back and looked at my Hansard contribution until yesterday. And it would fit very nicely if I tendered that contribution now and said very little more. I think, in fact, that I managed to express myself and my views about representation of our community, as well as the issues that we face as legislators on what is a most personal issue, a most difficult topic to grapple with, and that is the end of life. When you consider that we are literally talking about life or death, we are literally debating some legislation that will deal with ending people's lives by their own decision-making, let me point out. But nonetheless, it is not an issue that this Parliament should ever trifle with. And I have to say, as I did back in the contribution on the 15th of April last year, my apologies, 2015, that the spirit of the debate has been one that we should be very proud of. That when you consider the very difficult nature of the subject matter that we are discussing, we are debating, we are reviewing, this has probably brought out the very best of our Parliament. And at a time when there are shenanigans in parliaments around the world, including our own up in Canberra federally, it's a shame that this doesn't get an opportunity for our community to actually understand that they can be proud of the contribution that members make, irrespective of the content of their contribution, whether they are supporting or opposing the legislation that is before us. And the responsibility weighs very heavily on me. What is my role as a Member of Parliament? Is my responsibility to my community? And how is it that I make representations of that community in this place? Southern Metropolitan Region is a vast tract of land, south of the Yarra down to Sandringham, up through Hampton, Bentley, Oakley, Burwood, all the way up to North Balwyn and then back under the Yarra. We're talking now close to 500,000 people. It is not physically possible for me to have tried, nor would I have, to speak with each and every person within that region. There are members who have made in their contributions the notion that they have spoken with community leaders, that they have received hundreds, if not thousands, of emails that have been organised by groups both for and against. But what does that mean in the weight of the fact that nearly 500,000 people are voters within our region? What fate should I put on the place of this bill in relation to communications with maybe 2,000 or 3,000 people out of 500,000. This is something that each member will grapple with in their own way. They will make a determination in consideration of a whole range of matters and facts that they consider relevant in coming to an outcome. For me, unlike Mr. Purcell, I've not decided that that must be part of my guiding principles in relation to the legislation before us. I was not elected here as a Member of Parliament on a right of self-determination, although again in my inaugural speech I did note very clearly that I view myself as a social democrat, but more around, of course, jobs and economic prosperity and opportunity for our people, that they may be able to prosper and grow, of course. But for me, the right of self-determination is a guiding principle to the way that I act, the way that I govern, the way that I legislate, and indeed the way that I actually govern my ministerial portfolios. At times, that opens me up to allegations that I'm focused far more on the macro of a policy than the micro of a policy. I don't shy away from that. But if we fundamentally believe that each and every person has a right of self-determination within our society, that we believe in democracy, then we have a fundamental belief that people can actually make decisions for themselves. As challenging as those decisions may be, as difficult as those policy issues that we discuss may lead us to. And so what then leads me to those types of issues? Family, faith, love, life, suffering. We all experience those factors in our life. They make us who we are. We cannot get away from them. I had an exchange, a very lengthy email exchange that went back and forwards on multiple occasions with an Orthodox rabbi in the community, obviously as a proud member of the Jewish community. And one of the things that I said in that email exchange that will be very challenging for people in this place regardless of their faith. Why is it that my faith should somehow have a greater weighting in the decisions that I make as a legislator in comparison to the rights of an individual that may not be of the same faith as myself? Why should I allow my faith to dictate to me what is in the best interests of the community over and above the community itself? That's quite challenging. It was quite challenging for the rabbi that I had the discussion with, and it's quite challenging to try and remove oneself from your experiences and everything that has brought you to this point in life as a rationale for the decision-making that you come. And then, of course, that leads us to the policy itself. What is the policy trying to achieve? Does the policy actually achieve that? The legislation achieve what we're trying to arrive at? How is it trying to do that? What safeguards are built into the legislation to give us confidence that that right of self-determination is not a right that will be abused or a right that will be leveraged by people within whatever prism that they operate within, whether it be one out of love, one out of self-interest, one out of mischief-making, or one out of murderous intent. And so, Acting President, it's important to reflect that I believe very clearly that there are the safeguards in this bill that provide security for us to know that the implementation of the legislation that is before this place should give us confidence that people will be held to account should their actions prove otherwise. And this is important for us to reflect. No piece of legislation that ever comes before this place is perfect. The amount of legislation that we amend is proof positive of that. The fact that we have laws of murder show that humankind is not perfect either. That doesn't stop us from locking everybody up on a curfew and allowing each person out for 1 minute a day to ensure that acts of aggression or violence do not occur. So as a result, we need to actually reflect upon, again, the basics of what we're trying to achieve as a society. From my perspective, if people get it wrong, they're held to account. Under this scenario, there could be tragic consequences if people do try and coerce people to take the opportunity up under the voluntary assisted dying legislation before us. But that is no different from what can actually occur with this legislation if it is not passed by this Parliament. People can still coerce people to commit suicide right now. They don't need to suffer a terminal illness. They don't need to be in insufferable pain, incurable. But they do need to know that there are laws that punish them should people transgress. This legislation's no different. And so, of course, it's important to then understand that if you come from a very policy pure perspective in terms of that right of self-determination, then what is it that has helped me to get to the position where I am confidently supportive of the legislation before us? Well, there are indeed conversations that we have. We can't lock ourselves away and be blind to the nature of the discourse. And I'm going to recount two such conversations. I must say that I have sought permission on one occasion and not on the other. On the one occasion of the conversation I had it with a man, a very dear friend and also relative of my family's, an in-law on my wife's side of the family. A man that will be very well known within the Jewish community, a man by the name of Ephraim Finch. Ephraim, before he retired, was the head of the Melbourne Hevra Kadisha, which was the Orthodox funeral burial home in Melbourne. A man that will have seen more death in society than anyone in this place could ever speak to. A man that has provided pastoral care to people in their dying moments in hospitals, that has comforted loved ones in their hours of need. And I spoke to him recently and I asked Ephraim, what would he do if he was in my place? A member of the Orthodox Jewish community, and his response, and I asked permission to recount this conversation, was, Philip, I would pass the legislation and I would support it. So we must not move away from what this legislation is designed to do. It's designed to help people in the dying moments of their life from being in insufferable pain that cannot be cured by palliative care or modern medicine. This policy is designed to give people the choice and the chance and the right of self-determination above all else. I've had people in this chamber say, if somebody is 17 and a half or 6 days away from their 18th birthday, why can't they be able to access this legislation? Well, we have arbitrary rules across society. 18 years of age has been the point of which we, as a community, have bestowed adulthood upon people in the community. The right to vote, the right to purchase a drink legally in a licensed venue, the right to drive a motor vehicle. People that are 18 have the right. So yes, you could argue that somebody that presents with the same issues at 17 years and 361 days deserves the same rights as somebody that's at 18, but we as a community have a line in the sand, and that line in the sand is 18. And we shouldn't try and play around with that. But I want to come back. So my conversation with Ephraim was such that the pain that people can be in, the pain that people experience, is what this legislation is attempting to be able to alleviate for people in their own decision making. I found that conversation with Ephraim very, very elucidating for me personally. And the other person that I spoke to about this was my mum, and I didn't seek support from mum to be able to recount this conversation. But let me tell you, mum is not happy with me. Mum is also not happy with the government. Mum wants this legislation to go further. She doesn't think that allowing the legislation to be stopped at the point at which we do, the safeguards to which we have put in it, is sufficient. Mum wants to be able to make a medical power of attorney to say that should she be in a position to meet the following set of criteria, that she would like the outcome to be not dissimilar to obviously being provided with the injection of the medical cocktail that we have discussed. This is very challenging for me. I spoke in my contribution back in April 15 of my grandmother. What I didn't say in that contribution was twice when my parents were overseas and my aunt, who lives overseas permanently, twice when my grandmother broke her hip. I think one was at the age of 91 and the second time was at the age of 93, and she lived until the age of 96. Both times I had to say to the doctor, as the next of kin here, having had directions from my mum and aunt on phone calls overseas, to tell the doctor, should something happen on the table, do not resuscitate. It's a very heavy judgment to be provided to a grandson when there are children between the grandson and the grandparent. Now, to put this into perspective, for those that don't know my family history, my grandmother was a tough old bird. In 1935, 8 days after she was married to my grandfather, the Nazis took my grandfather and put him in Dachau concentration camp. For 3.5 years, she'd never worked in a day of life before. She worked every day to save money and be able to look after herself. In 1938, she had enough money to be able to see passage for her two brothers, my grandmother's parents, and she got my grandfather out of camp when the Nazis said, we will allow the Jews to leave without any of their worldly possessions, as then they are no longer our problem. And she sought passage for them and took them to Shanghai, where my mother and my aunt were born. My grandfather wasn't able to work in the early years in Shanghai. Such was the recovery from being in concentration camps. She looked after that family, and she made that family come out to Australia when they got visas, refugee visas in fact, and she forged a new life for my family here in Australia. So to give a do not resuscitate direction to the doctors at the time was extraordinarily challenging for me. But it wasn't my call. It was my mother and my aunt's call who had the right for that determination. Whether I or not will ever make use of this legislation, should I be in this position, is absolutely irrelevant to me as a legislator. Because it's not about me. It's about providing the right to somebody else without me telling them what they can and can't do as an adult in our community. If somebody meets the criteria, if they are of sound mind, if they have met with 2 different doctors, if they have written a request to access this opportunity, it is not my position to tell them that they cannot. But we need to make sure that when they undertake that process, without fear of coercion, without concern that there is any possibility of impropriety. But as I said earlier, we cannot guard against that forever and a day, which is why there are penalties associated should that occur. And some people will argue, well, that is enough to vote against the legislation because a life lost under those circumstances is a life too many. And that will be a perspective for some. But as I said, we don't lock everybody up down the street to make sure that they don't commit crimes just in the aspect that they might. So we need to also be able, at some point, to measure against the weights of the individual and the rights of the individual versus the weights and the rights of the community as a whole. So there's no doubt that this is probably one of the most challenging pieces of legislation that I may actually ever come across in my parliamentary career, however long that lasts. But my view on weighing this up from the time that I made a contribution back on the 15th of April in 2015 until today has not fundamentally changed. I am satisfied with the way that the Minister, Jill Hennessy, Professor Brian Owler and his team, I'm satisfied with the protections that have been built in for adults to be able to access this off their own decision making. And at this point I want to thank a number of people for their contributions thus far. I want to very specifically thank Jill Hennessy. I think this is a very challenging piece of legislation, and I think that Jill has acquitted herself very well, Acting President, as a Minister of the Crown, as a human being, and as somebody that has grappled with this policy themselves. Acting President, I don't wish to reflect on the Chair, but I also wanted to thank you. You have championed the opportunity for people for self-determination for some time. And we have seen a spirit around the chamber of people from different political parties, backgrounds, walks of life, come together to support this right of self-determination. I extend that thanks to you, Ms Hartland, and note that this has been a very long policy for you. Back in 2008 you were unsuccessful. You've announced your retirement at the next election, and wouldn't this be nice for you to be able to leave this place knowing that the policy pursuits that you have committed your professional political career to have been able to come to fruition. I mentioned Professor Brian Owler moments ago, and I want to thank him. Professor Owler provided time on a one-on-one meeting with me some month or two ago where I put to him a range of concerns that I had, difficulties that I was facing, and he answered each and every question and was very generous with his time. And I want to thank him for the professionalism that he has shown at each and every stage and the dedication that he has provided amidst what would also be no doubt challenging issues for him as a medical practitioner and also as a father and a member of this community. I also like to thank Ms Wooldridge for the work that she's done in this place also, and say to everybody that maybe, just maybe, a controversial piece of legislation should not have to be what brings us together to bring out the very best of this parliament, irrespective of what our views are, what the politics show, or what our decisions will be. And Acting President, with that, I commend this bill to the House.